Hello everyone! This video is going to be different to my normal content, in that it is not going to be about science at all. But since so much of my content is about skepticism, I feel that it's necessary at this early stage in my channel to get some stuff off my chest about when my own skepticism cataclysmically failed, to my significant detriment, and to the detriment of people who I care about. This video started off as a typical silly debunk style video, but it got harder and harder and harder to justify writing this video that way the further things went on and the more personal this story got. So, forewarning, things in this video are going to get dark. This video is about how I accidentally spent almost 3 years in a cult. A cult that I now view as very, very dangerous and deeply harmful. Before I begin, I'm going to include some trigger warnings for discussion of the following topics: coercion, sexual violence, cults, brainwashing, manipulation, zealotry, homophobia, spousal abuse, and conspiracy theories. If you are uncomfortable discussing any of these topics, please feel free to skip this video. My next one will be a fun, light-hearted one about Moa, and then we'll get back to more normal content. Before you guys judge me for what I'm going to talk about, I want to point out that I was straight out of high school. At the time, my confidence was basically non-existent due to years of bullying, and I was way too impressionable. Now, I started as a geology student at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus in 2013, and after moving, I wanted to find a church in the area. As many of you know, I was raised a Christian, and I still am one. If people are interested in how I rationalize my faith with science and with me being, let's be honest, the least cute trans girl in science YouTube, then maybe that'll be a topic for a video if anyone else is interested. But that is not really the purpose of this channel, which is supposed to be about science communication in a fun way, and it will be moving forward. When I started university in 2013, I wanted to find a church that I fit in with people my age who I could connect with and make friends with. And at the Freshers' Fair event, which is an event in first year where all the clubs go out and set up stalls and connect with one another, there was a young woman there named Onyeka, who was there to advertise and evangelize for an on-campus church that she was leading, which was part of a broader global movement called Christ Embassy, otherwise known as Believers Love World, or BLW. I asked her a lot of skeptical questions, and on the day she gave really good answers. And when I looked the church and group up, I saw no indication that they were a cult, and only found positive responses to them as a Christian movement, save for a few very fanatical types who were criticizing the group's leader, Pastor Chris Oyakilome. BLW is a huge global megachurch with millions of followers worldwide. They run Christian TV channels around the world, they have a publishing house and record labels with tons of popular works with popular Christian singers. BLW are practically inescapable in Christian circles. In retrospect though, I should have actually listened to the fanatical types about Pastor Chris being a lying false teacher, but we'll get to that! When I started BLW, I met some really lovely people and we had a lot of deep theological discussions, and Onyeka was consistently able to answer all of my questions really well. So I thought, you know, I'll give this campus church a go. And for the first few months, I loved it. It was a bit conspicuous how I was the only white person and the church was culturally very African, with it being a Nigerian movement, but if anything, that was really good for me. I was raised by a pretty racist dad and granny, and being there and befriending a lot of diverse people from different backgrounds just destroyed a lot of these stereotypes and frankly lies that I had been told growing up, and frankly obliterated my granny's old-timey opinion that women shouldn't be preachers, because frankly Onyeka was brilliant. At the time, I also became a huge fan of Pastor Chris, and I was consistently amazed by his vast scriptural knowledge, his wise and broadly applicable sermons, his enthusiasm, and his ability to reach people with the gospel. For a young Christian, this felt like the place to be. I mean, sure, the Christian Fellowship didn't want to associate with them, which should have been a red flag, but hey, I'm sure that was nothing, right? Ugh. Despite how hard and fast I fell for this movement, I will confess that I did find some things weird early on. Firstly, we only ever heard from one of two preachers during the services, that being Onyeka, who would later become Pastor Onyeka, who would deliver sermons, which, by the way, in BLW they call sermons messages, so I'll just refer to them as messages throughout to avoid confusion and clarifying. So yeah, it would either be Onyeka or Pastor Chris himself through video messages filmed at his Nigeria-based megachurch. As part of BLW, and part of BLW who is basically being groomed for leadership, I was encouraged by Pastor Onyeka to listen to a Pastor Chris message every single day, as well as buy and read as many of Pastor Chris's books as I could. Pastor Onyeka would even ask me every once in a while which messages I had listened to that preceding week to ensure that I was getting my daily dose of Pastor Chris wisdom. In the cult, Pastor Chris is overwhelmingly treated as the spiritual authority in the world, and I was actively discouraged from discussing other preachers I liked whose work wasn't approved. On days where I was put in charge of the service, there was once a time where I showed some people briefly a message from a preacher I liked, and I got somewhat scolded for it. Every month we would watch a live stream communion service for the month with Pastor Chris at his big Nigeria-based megachurch in Lagos, and at the end of each service there would be a thing where he and other pastors would meet and they'd discuss letters, and every time that happened, Pastor Chris could correct other pastors, but I noticed that no other pastors would ever correct or disagree with him, because it was clear that they viewed him as, and according to himself he is, ordained by God as holding the office of man of God, prophet, apostle, teacher, and pastor. Basically, every single position of authority Chris claims he has been blessed with, and I'll show you a video of him directly saying as much later. Due to his admittedly vast biblical knowledge, everyone there basically accepts and views him as flawless. But I gradually realized later on in my time at the cult that some of the things he had said were both outright heretical and frankly really frickin' sexist. For example, in one sermon that I discovered after I left the cult, Chris claimed that women were not part of God's original design for humankind, and that God solely made women because of men. I've attached this article in which he basically says over and over that women are less than men. It's gross, and his claim that women weren't a part of God's plan is literally contradicted by the Bible. Like Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4, where Paul writes that God chose us before the foundation of the world. If God knew who we were going to be before he made the world, then he obviously knew that some of us were going to be women. This rhetoric. This is rhetoric that puts down women in the cult to make them inherently feel less deserving and more like they should be subservient to their supposed betters. This got even worse when it became apparent after his divorce from his wife that he was extremely neglectful of her. Even living in a completely different country, with her living in the UK, allegedly wanting to go back to him, and him refusing to let her go to Nigeria because their personalities would be too big to be in the same place. And she has actively accused him of lying and emotionally abusing her on older posts on her Facebook account. According to this article in the Nigerian newspaper Punch, Chris claimed on a social media post that husbands should literally be the masters of their wives explicitly, not their partners, which only encourages spousal abuse in the church and encourages men to view their wives as slaves. This got even more concerning when he talked about himself after the Nigerian media and several of his own churchgoers criticized him for his treatment of Anita and his statements about women. He stated on live television, "There are preachers and there are men of God. I am not a preacher, I am a man of God. A man of God is not someone who worships God or preaches God. A man of God is someone handpicked by God, set on a course by God. If you study the scriptures, you will not find one man of God go against God, sinning against God." This is despite the fact that the Bible is littered with men of God who sin against God. Pastor Chris often references the life of David in particular in his preaching, so surely he must have realized how utterly wrong this claim was before he said it, given that David is called a man of God in the scripture repeatedly, and that he most definitely sins when it comes to Bathsheba and Uriah. I distinctly remember seeing a video where Chris blamed Pastor Anita's wanting to divorce him on her not being spiritually mature. From what I can tell, that video seems to have been deleted from YouTube.
When it comes to Reverend Anita, what I would say to you, pray for her. Don't act like, if you're married to a man of God, it doesn't make you automatically mature. You can make mistakes. You can do something that's wrong. But people expect the wife of a minister to definitely be at the level of that minister. And so they may be looked upon and the expectations may be like that. But it's a positional thing. All right? It's a positional thing. If a man of God is married, it doesn't automatically mean that the wife of the man of God is therefore a woman of God. That's not the way it is in the Bible. That's why you don't really find the wives of men of God mentioned in the Bible.
But I had read a lot of Anita's articles in the Rhapsody of Realities, saw several of her old video messages, and frankly, I don't understand any Christian who could listen to her and say she is not spiritually mature and is not living a life devoted to Jesus. Chris seemingly refuses to see his own blame in the situation and refuses to acknowledge the extreme misogyny and cruelty of his own words. For some of these issues, see this blog post on Chris's claims following the divorce. Now, this was actually happening while I was in the cult in 2014. I was there from 2013 to 2016, and no one wanted to talk about this. I suddenly noticed one day during a service, when we received our Rhapsodies of Realities for that month, that Anita had stopped being a writer on them. The Rhapsody of Realities, by the way, is the cult's daily devotional publication and something that we were required to use for evangelism. And I asked Donieka about the fact that Anita was no longer an author, and she was kind of shady about it. She said quite quietly, "We'll talk about that later," but then we never did. I had no idea about this divorce at the time, and I just assumed that she had taken a back step from writing the daily devotional. I don't think Onyeka wanted me to know what had been going on, because I don't think she was comfortable with it. Chris's misogyny and attacks on his wife's character were not something that we as a campus ministry ever saw hints of, presumably because I think the higher-ups at BLW's campus ministry know that Chris isn't the perfect man that they were indoctrinating us to believing that he is, not the kind of person that they were indoctrinating their campus leaders to believe he is. In this regard, I don't actually think that Onyeka knew the whole story, though I might be wrong, but I think she was clearly also concerned about it based on her expression when I asked. And I did not find out about this stuff until very shortly before I ghosted the cult and left. If I had known about Pastor Chris's misogyny, I would have left immediately. I want to make that clear. We were given a sanitized view of this man. And I am angry that the leaders of campus ministry did not want me or anyone else to know about this, especially since they would later go on to ask me, a then 21-year-old who is struggling with uni work and frankly really stressed with every aspect of my life, to lead the fellowship on campus after Onyeka graduated. Bear in mind, I was 21 and they wanted me to lead a church. Whilst I was starting to feel increasingly uncertain about the leadership of the church and its messaging. But I also want to point out that Onyeka would have only been about 19 when she was put in charge of the group. Putting someone that young in charge of the chapter of a cult is, as far as I'm concerned, an absurd abuse of power over young people. And a demented thing to put on someone that young with that little life experience. Especially given the sheer amount of pressure that is put on you to build the movement, to preach, to evangelize. This is not something that people that young should be forced to deal with alongside university. They're basically asking you to do a full-time job on top of your university work. I wanted to talk to Onyeka before I made this video, but unfortunately all of her social media has seemingly been deleted, like literally all of it. This post on BLW Campus Ministries page from 2016 is literally the only evidence of her existence I can now even find on the internet. Onyeka, if you are watching this, I really hope that you're doing well, and the fact that you seem to have disappeared from the web is concerning to me. Because I really do value you, and I think that we are both victims of this cult, whether you are still a member or not. In a lighter note, on the topic of me having briefly been put in charge of the on-campus ministry, here's a t-shirt that I got as part of the cult. They basically ran out of guys' ones, but I didn't mind because, but I didn't mind. God, I was such a trans egg. They were basically like, just wear a girl's one and put a blazer over it. I was very happy about that for very cisgender reasons. Now, back to Pastor Chris just lying about things in the Bible. There's also this sermon where he claimed that it is possible for Christians to live without sinning, seemingly ignoring 1 John chapter 1 verse 8, which says, if we claim to live without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Instead, Pastor Chris claims that if you're mature, you can't sin because his seed is in you.
He says you cannot sin because his seed is in you.
I find it absurd that there would be so many scriptures about sin if it was something that even the mature among us didn't need to at least be on some guard about. And I say this as someone who is on lots of strong guard against sin and is a wholesome, innocent being and totally hasn't been railed by some number of cute trans girls. God, I'm so cringe. Then, from lockdown onwards, Pastor Chris really seemed to fall down some kind of demented rabbit hole. I left the cult around 2016, so this was all after I left. Most prominently in the media, there's this instance where he predicted the timing of the rapture. See this video linked in the description, where Pastor Chris claimed that the rapture of the church will happen in the next 3 or 6 or 10 years.
If it is a cross, you have 6.5 years before he shows up. But because 2020 has gone past 6 months already, you're in September, that means you have just 6 years. Which means, if it doesn't happen in 3 years, it might be 6. If it doesn't happen in 6, cannot exceed 10.
Based on calculations and interpretations of news events. At the time I thought, holy cow, this is at serious risk of turning your Jesus-focused church and student ministry into a doomsday cult. And it directly contradicts Matthew chapter 26 verse 36, where Jesus said that he doesn't know when the day of the Lord will come, nor do the angels, only the Father. So Pastor Chris is basically saying he knows more than Jesus. Pastor Karen Victor, another senior leader in Christ Embassy who runs the Christ Embassy Cape Town megachurch and occasionally appears on Christian TV channels, directly claims in this video, made after Chris had alluded to this, that we're in the last couple of years before the rapture. I also had quite a lot of other issues with Pastor Karen's teaching in this video, particularly the fact that she claims Christians should not be friends with non-Christians, seemingly ignoring 1 Corinthians 9 verses 20 to 22, which encourages us to become like the people we wish to save in order to make connections with them so that we can use that to bring them to Christ. I was repeatedly told by Pastor Onyeka, more high-up people at the cult, that I should not be best friends with non-Christians. But Karen Victor took it further and said that we simply should not even be friends at all with non-Christians. Insane! From a Christian perspective, you're not going to save anyone if you're not fucking friends with them. But also, it encourages people in the cult to only associate with people in the cult, and thus become isolated from their actual friends and family and from real-world news. Editing interjection here. I just realized that there were 2 really important things I forgot to talk about. One relates to the isolation, the fact that they literally founded their own social media company called King's Chat and encouraged people to use that rather than Facebook. So you're not, interacting with the regular people, you're only interacting with other people in the cult. And the other, there was a weird instance a few years ago where Pastor Chris claimed that Kamala Harris is possessed by demons. Just thought you should know that. This is particularly notable because of how critical BLW leadership tends to be of other Christian denominations. The implication seemingly being that you can only reliably confirm that someone is a Christian if they are a part of BLW. They want you isolated from everyone else. I remember one message I listened to where Chris seemingly just fabricated a quote from the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, claiming that the bishop said he was no longer convinced of the resurrection. And seemingly just to say, hey look, Anglicans follow this dude, his stuff he says is a bit sus, y'all should follow me instead. And should Pastor Chris's predictions regarding the timing of the rapture not come true, I am terrified of how this will affect the people who have put so much of their faith in Chris's teachings. And I'm terrified of how they will act in that final year out of the 10 within which he has insisted that the rapture will happen. Even before Chris made these predictions, BLW has always held the position that we are in the last days before the rapture. This is something that Pastor Onyeka told me the second time I ever met her, including her belief that she was not going to die, she was going to be raptured. When I say that the people believe in Pastor Chris, I really mean it. Promotional material for BLW events call him the prophet of our generation, our man of God and commander-in-chief, and God's finest commander-in-chief of the end-time army. And I directly remember one poster for a conference around 2020-ish, around 3 years after I left the cult, calling him the commander-in-chief of God's forces on earth. Though I can't actually find that poster to prove it, but I think you'll believe me given this stuff. In the preceding years, before the pandemic though, Chris was getting increasingly more right-wing with his politics. I remember seeing a video that baffled me shortly after I left, where he once received a letter on one of his live TV programs where someone asked him why people hate Donald Trump. Both that time, which seems to have been deleted from YouTube, and in this separate clip, which I'll show you now, Chris claims that people hate Trump because Trump supports Christians, and that anyone who hates Trump actually just hates Christians.
There are those who think that Trump, the President of the United States, is hated by many Americans. He is not hated by many Americans. I want to tell you the truth. He is not hated. Trump is not the problem. They don't hate Trump. They hate those that Trump seems to support.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
They're angry at Trump for supporting Christians. You better know it. So the real ones they hate are you who are Christians. That's what the hatred of Trump is all about. It's got nothing to do with Trump. Before he started giving his voice in support of Christians and in support of Israel, before he started giving his voice, he was the friend of the left. Don't forget. He was their darling. They loved him. But because it didn't come from their sponsorship, and they didn't expect him to become president, they blamed the evangelicals, they blamed the Christians for voting him into office. And that's what they hate him for. So if you're a Christian, better know that. Don't think, oh, if we just get Trump out of the way, then everything will just be calm. It will not be calm. They hate you.
This completely ignores all of the untold lies, dangerous policies, bigotry, climate change inaction, environmental damage that his first administration was doing at the time. He put this whole thing on people hate Christians, that's why they hate Trump. I was utterly shocked when I saw this, especially given how left-wing so many members of BLW had seemed to be, and I had got the impression previously that he had been based on all the sermons that I had seen, minus their obvious prosperity angle. His ex-wife Anita is an extremely vocal critic of Trump. Then there was this clip advertising a talk that Chris was giving at a major conference, in which he literally calls the then current pandemic a plandemic.
There's a second and a third wave approaching. We've been preparing.
Commander-in-Chief.
As the stratego,
There has been a change in the strategy.
Stratomai.
I think it's high time for us to gather all the troops from all over the world. Formation Indigo, Charlie, Lima, Charlie, 2021.
Yes, sir!
There were also instances where BLW churches, as urged by Chris, would continue to meet during the heights of lockdown, putting people at significantly elevated risk of contracting the virus. Chris has also directly lied to his churchgoers by claiming baselessly, with no evidence, that the pandemic was planned in advance by governments, and does this seemingly in order to elevate himself in the name of spreading God's word. And I was utterly shocked when I saw the outright heresy in what he was saying. But it got worse, because according to this BBC News article, it's in pidgin English, so a little bit hard to read, on his UK TV channel, Love World UK, which no longer exists because it kept spreading misinformation, Pastor Chris claimed that the pandemic was planned by the deep state using 5G technology. 5G cannot transmit a virus, which is a physical object, not a wavelength. This makes zero sense. I just could not believe that someone whose sermons around 8 years earlier had helped me grow so much in faith and learn so much about Jesus was now actively, demonstrably lying to millions of people about the pandemic and spreading baseless, nonsensical conspiracy theories while seemingly constantly elevating himself as though he is the defining prophet of our age and the most spiritually mature person on earth. I am terrified of the direction his teaching is going, and terrified for the friends I have back in the UK who still attend these churches. Something that was talked a lot about at BLW whilst I was there was the healing school that they run, which is basically a series of massive faith healing events that Chris runs, mostly out of Nigeria, where people book tickets and come to the event, and some of them allegedly learn how to faith heal, and they all allegedly receive healing for their ailments. I was really taken in by this. I really believed that they were doing this on the basis of all the testimonies I had heard about this healing school from people I trusted, people I met who had attended these events, and from their videos, because I did not believe that these people would lie to me. And I still don't believe that the people I know who went were lying. I think that they themselves were lied to and tricked. This was something that convinced me so much that this was the church I had to follow because they were doing miracles, I thought. I heard so many testimonies of people claiming they had been healed in videos, people claiming they had been healed of cancers at these events and other serious sicknesses. And then the week I decided to cut off contact with the rest of BLW, it was because I found this testimony on the blog Nairaland, which broke my heart and shattered my faith in these people. According to someone who claimed to have been present at a healing school event, the lines of people who were allowed to receive healing from Pastor Chris on video included people in wheelchairs, included people in wheelchairs who were able to walk for limited periods. In short, he took people that he knew could get out of wheelchairs for a spectacle and made it look like he performed a miracle. Those people no how believed that they had actually been cured at the time. But something that a lot of Chris's sermons on healing that I distinctly remember talked about was how in Chris's philosophy, if you pray for something and believe that you have received it, it will be yours. This is the core focus of his book, How to Pray Effectively, which I own, sadly. And thanks to his philosophy, Chris says if you doubt that you have been healed, if you don't believe it, then you lose your healing. So, if someone is healed at one of these so-called healing events, and believes it, but goes to a doctor to check that they've been healed, check that they are actually better, then... Sorry. then the doctor will not find you to have been healed, because you're going to check means that you were of ill faith. So, of course, people would go there, they might have had these cancers, and then believed they were healed, and then they just wouldn't go back to a doctor to check if they'd been healed. All Chris was doing was giving these people false hope and using both manipulation and the placebo effect. Like, how many people believed that they had been healed from devastating cancers and illnesses and stopped treatment because they believed they had been healed because of this? How many people have died because of that? And in this testimony, it got even worse, because the writer claims that there were crowds of people who were deeply sick, who were injured, who couldn't walk, who were paralyzed, who were deaf, who were blind, who went to that event desperate for healing. And they weren't put in the lines of the people to be healed. They were, according to this person, and this was backed up by people who commented on it, told to wait outside in the hot sun, not shown any compassion, and forced to just wait and receive nothing. And reading this broke me. John chapter 13 verse 35 says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." So I have to ask Pastor Chris, where was the love for the people who were shut outside? After I read that, I just stopped holding sermons. I didn't tell anyone, I just stopped. I ignored all the messages I got from higher-ups at the cult. I even ignored Onyeka for a really long time. I ignored the people I was supposed to be responsible for. I broke. I realized that the person so many people I knew and trust and love had put their hopes in for salvation was almost certainly lying to us. And I didn't know how to process it, so I just didn't. I ran. Like, I should have held a meeting with everyone on campus, explained why I couldn't do this anymore, why I'd lost faith in the people above me. Maybe I should have tried to keep the campus church in place, but separated from BLW. But I was just so overwhelmed by uni work, by things going on in my personal life, and I cracked. And I spent so long just crying, unable to work out what the hell I was supposed to do, so I lied. Over and over about my time with BLW, I embellished the good because I couldn't live with the shame of what I had been a part of. I hated myself for having done evangelism for the group. Like, BLW is a very evangelism-focused organization, and my time in leadership with that, I'm sorry. And in my later time in leadership in that, my faith was on such shaky ground because I was doing a terrible job of that evangelism. And I kept thinking, there's something wrong with me. And then I found this out, and and the unfortunate thing is that in my evangelism, I did reach people. And to anyone I did reach, anyone who joined that cult in part because of me, I am so sorry. Like, I can only say I'm sorry. I was too young, I was manipulated, I was love-bombed. I was only ever told part of the picture, and that is true, but that does not excuse my participation in this. I'm sorry. A red flag I should have picked up on much earlier was Offer 7. More broadly, offerings and tithings, but I do want to specifically focus on Offer 7 after that. BLW has always had a pretty strong focus on offerings and tithes. We even had a whole sermon series around them for a few weeks. And there was this strong emphasis with offerings that whatever you donated, you would receive a multiplied harvest. Now, that phrasing, receive a multiplied harvest, sounds like a Bible quote. To the extent that anyone there would just assume it is. But while it is phrased similar to 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 6, it actually isn't a Bible quote. There was a consistent strong emphasis on prosperity gospel teaching while I was there, but because of how well defended everything was scripturally, I didn't really consider that, hey, Jesus repeatedly told everyone who followed him to give up all their worldly possessions to follow him, and said that it was easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than it was for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But I distinctly remember being at a BLW conference in London. I went to quite a lot of these. And Deacon Jude Okogba, who is a very senior guy in the cult's UK leadership, said, "I'm happy to pay for anyone's hotel rooms because I am rich because of the blessings of God." He was literally trying to say that God had made him monetarily rich because of his faith and because of how much he had given to the church. The same God who said it's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle made him rich for his faith. This actually did set off alarm bells in my head. As you know, this is a heavily skepticism-focused channel, and I have a very skeptical brain, and this brain caused me to ask one of the other pastors about this in the taxi later that day after the conference was over. I think the pastor I talked to's name was David, but I can't remember that well. This was like 10 years ago now. And this pastor said something along the lines of, "Yeah, but it's okay if that wealth comes from God because it shows you're mature and he's blessing you." You might think, oh my gosh, our skeptic queen, DJ King, is gonna obliterate him for this answer. But, no. I was stupid. That answer worked for me because everything else at the conference had been so awesome to me. But on the topic of wealth, we need to talk about Pastor Chris's wealth itself. The man owns a record label, a publishing house, a global mega church with millions of donations per week from millions of members, and the Nigerian website Legit gives him an estimated net worth, an estimated personal net worth of $50 million US. He owns 30 cars, and apparently, according to that website, has his own fucking private jet. I actually think that $50 million is a wild underestimate, since while most of the donations we give per week get funneled to church activities, to church ministries, every year on Pastor Chris's birthday is something called Offer 7, which we were all encouraged to participate in. What's Offer 7? Well, Offer 7 is a donation that everyone in the cult is encouraged to give Pastor Chris himself to celebrate his birthday and to thank him for enriching our lives. If memory serves, I was asked if I would pay £10, which is around 20 New Zealand dollars for those of us here, towards it in my first year at BLW. So I gave $20 to a multi-millionaire. Every year, millions of people around the world give him tens of dollars each. So, like, he is making tens of millions of dollars personally in a single day every single year. I hate the fact that I felt so grateful to this misogynistic, vile man that I actually donated to him. And you know what actually makes this even worse? In 2014, one BLW pastor posted in the Nairaland blog expressing his abject shock that he had been emailed by Christ Embassy higher-ups demanding that members of each parish each donate at least 10 million naira, which is around 1,000 New Zealand dollars, for the celebration of that year. So the whole community of a few churches together, they wanted to gather up between them $1,000 fucking dollars just to give him for his fucking birthday present. And they were putting pressure on pastors demanding this. Chris was asking very poor, impoverished communities in impoverished parts of his own country to give him this money to thank him for enriching their lives. Where is the biblical, Christ-like humility in that? And if Christ's demands were met in that year, and frankly I doubt they were far off given how devoted so many of his followers are, then this pastor who made this blog calculated, based on the number of participants in each parish, that in Nigeria alone, that year's Offer 7, Pastor Chris would have personally made $30 million for himself just that year, just from Nigeria, not even including the thousands of other chapters that are all over the world in other countries. BLW has a large presence across Britain and has an active, in my opinion, predatory program to establish churches on every university campus in the country, because they are targeting young, impressionable minds. Young, impressionable minds he is targeting to make himself a multi-millionaire. And they are vocally, openly, celebratorily trying to do this everywhere, all over the world. I believe that Pastor Chris has personally made hundreds of millions of dollars by manipulating the faith of mostly young, impressionable people straight out of high school, getting them to found churches through their time at university and manipulating them with the goal of enriching himself. And now we need to talk about something really important that I have been avoiding talking about, which is homophobia from Pastor Chris. During my time at BLW, homosexuality came up only once, and this was in one of the video messages that we watched by Pastor Chris during my time leading the fellowship. Up until that time, I had just assumed, based on my past experiences growing up in the church, growing up in a Methodist church, that this church was also a supportive and inclusive environment. Our fellowship was very racially diverse, very diverse in terms of backgrounds, and I always wanted to ensure that we were a supportive environment for queer people. We did have one gay member who was there quite often, and I cannot for the life of me remember if he was there this day. But what happened on this sermon left me shocked and just gobsmacked, because I had always thought that we were doing, being this supportive and inclusive environment. But then one of the sermons we watched around 2 months before I left involved Pastor Chris when he was talking about like Satan's forces on earth in terms of like, you know, the things that the church is there to combat, talked about the homosexuals as part of Satan's forces. And he described pride movements as part of how Satan was corrupting the youth. And I was just gobsmacked and confused after having seen zero sign of this bigotry before. Here's something that he said in a more recent video, erroneously titled, "Nobody was born a gay."
I understand there are some Christians who are still unsure whether it is right or wrong to be gay. Are you out of your mind? You don't want to read the Bible? The first book of the Bible, Genesis, talks about gays, talks about their community, and talks about how God despises what they do, and how God destroyed two cities because of their attitude, because of their sins.
This is despite the fact that the sin of Sodom was, according to Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 to 50, now this was the sin of Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. So the sins of Sodom included pride, apathy, complacency, idleness, and unconcern for the underprivileged. There is, of course, discussion of homosexuality in the sins of Sodom in other passages, but like, those are basically talking about mass gang rape. The exact nature of many of the scriptures condemning homosexuality that Chris talks about are also kind of a mess, and mostly seem to have stemmed from a translation error as recently as 1946, as talked about in this article in The Advocate, and mostly were referring to man-on-boy paedophilia. But Pastor Chris twisted this prolific mistranslation into an excuse for bigotry, and in so doing, I think he directly harmed me. Which, when I saw this message, when it was playing, I ran out of the room. And I was leading. Like, I was leading the service, we were just doing this video message that week, and I just had a full-on panic attack, because I just thought, oh God, like, why is this man I put so much respect in attacking queer people this way? Why is he referring to them as the homosexuals, like talking about them like they're not even people? You noticed that, you may have noticed that in the other clip I just showed you. He said nobody was born a gay. Like, not no one was born gay, he says a gay. It's like he's talking about queer people like they're animals. And I was scared that I might get challenged on it, and I might have been forced... as the person who was leading that chapter at the time, because I thought, oh God, am I going to be forced to defend homophobia, because I would not have been able to live with myself. And I had a panic attack, and I just ran to the loo, and I just cried, and then I came back, and I acted like I was all good and all fine. And I briefly allowed myself, because of how much I respected his thoughts, to shut down things that have been just tearing my own heart apart. I was thinking of a scripture which was often brought up in Pastor Chris's sermons, where he talks about, I can't remember exactly where this scripture is in the Bible, but there's a scripture which talks about how the word of God, you know, you can't contain it because it feels like there's a fire shut up in your bones, that you can't let stay there. And I forced myself to believe that what was inside that was hurting was just that. I forced myself to believe that that was what was torturing me. And I just kept that mindset, and I kept that mindset, and I kept my mindset for so many years until I cracked. And that didn't happen until after I left. Like, that should have been the breaking point, and I hate the fact that there was like another 2 months before I left. I felt like such a hypocrite for not leaving immediately, but I felt my responsibility for the people there, and I still believed so much of what he was saying, but the doubt that went into my head from that moment, it festered and it festered and it festered. And the more I learned, when I was looking up the healing school, when I found out about all the stuff that had been going on with Chris and his wife, I just ghosted them. That said, I'm telling you this about the cult because I want people to learn from my mistakes. I don't want you to fall for something like this. I think if someone is saying something that you don't think sounds right, you should check. You should always be skeptical, and I wasn't. And part of why I have made so much of this channel about skepticism in recent years is because I need to be better at it. I know that. Because I cataclysmically failed. And I let myself down, and I let so many people down because of it. So, I need to reintroduce myself to you so that I am no longer letting myself down. Hi, my name is Dr. Diana King. She, her pronouns. I am both trans and bi. I dealt with a lot of issues of dysphoria growing up, which I never realized I could do anything about until I was in my 20s. I've been on estrogen and Spiro for slightly over a year, and discussions by Pastor Chris like that which I discuss directly harmed my ability to accept who I am as a person. And I fear for any queer person within BLW. Chris is calling gay people a gay or the homosexuals sounds more like how you would talk about animals than people. So please know, if you are in BLW and you are queer, or even if you are just in BLW and you have doubts, or please know, your entire support network should not only comprise people in that cult. People who do not believe that you are valid or worthy of love for who you are. People who will try to change you and pressure you into things you do not feel comfortable doing. I promise, you are valid. There is a better life out there for you. And there are people who will love you for who you are. You deserve that. I am making this video in the hopes that people can learn from my mistakes. Remember to stay skeptical and to actually act on your red flags like I should have. Thank you very, very much to everyone for watching this. I appreciate that this video was probably not very easy to watch. It was really, really hard to film. And it was not my usual kind of content. I try to be fun on this channel. I try to be silly. I try to be goofy. And I'm gonna be in the future. I needed you all to know this. So yeah. God bless you all. And thank you. Thank you for watching.